Oh, we're back again. I guess for whatever reason it stopped recording, so we'll pick up right where we left off. Lauren was telling us about
Oh, in the movie, one of the points that was brought up that I hadn't considered was that many of the scholars that Tim Mahoney, the guy who made the movie, spoke to had been raised in Bible believing homes and they stopped believing in God or questioned his existence heavily because as they learned about archaeology or about history
the supposed history.
and they questioned and decided that Moses could not have written the Torah, that's kind of the basis by which the rest of the Bible functions. Jesus himself refers to Moses writing the Torah.
That was the thing that kind of shocked me is that it talks about the Gospels and Jesus is speaking, and he says, Moses wrote of me. And I started thinking, well, he's literally saying Moses wrote the Torah. It's
Right,
not a matter of some other historian writing on behalf of Moses.
right.
This is actually Moses wrote of me.
So if you take away in your mind, if you prove to yourself that Moses could absolutely, positively not ever have written the Torah, this is a complete fairy tale. It's just invented by people many years later. The rest of the Bible falls apart. If Moses did not write down the words of his eyewitness report of the laws that God gave him, nothing else in the Bible has validity.
Right. So that's pretty important.
That was a pretty shocking conclusion.
Well, that's a great transition into the Torah portion. Just go right from Moses wrote the Torah to the Torah portion. We were reading in Leviticus. I don't know exactly where, but I think it's chapter 7 and the various areas here. And there's one particular thing that kind of caught our mind, caught our attention
Since Passover is coming up.
since Passover is coming up. So every Passover, there would always be the timeline debate. Everybody would talk about, okay, was he crucified on a Friday? Oh no, the Catholics
No,
say
this
that.
only happens among Christians. This doesn't
Okay,
happen among
among Christians.
among Christians interested in Passover.
Among Christians interested in timelines and Passover and how everything operated. And for years and years, I would hear, okay, a Thursday pass, no, a Wednesday Passover. No, in order to have 3 days and 3 nights is this and that. And finally, I just had to solve it. I had to figure it out for myself, and or at least come up with something that I felt comfortable with,
And I,
that put at ease.
and I didn't understand why you had to do this because to me it was pretty obvious. Jesus was crucified on a Wednesday, and then there was a Thursday
Multiple
high Sabbath,
Sabbaths, right?
and then there was a Friday, which somehow the women spent the entire day shopping for spices, even though Joseph and Nicodemus managed to gather enough in a few hours.
Well,
Anyway, I thought this was very easy to explain.
all that to say that every single Passover in our circle, we hear the over and over again, 3 days and 3 nights, and we see
It's
the sign of
the
Jonah, and we
only
see the
sign that Jesus is Messiah.
right, and you've got those charts, the charts that show up again and again by
I know
high
them by heart.
by highly respected people, by the way, people that we respect very highly. But
So we've
but
we've heard this
I
a long time.
basically I came to the conclusion that that can't possibly be right.
And I said, "You're kidding me. Please don't go there."
And just about anybody I tell that that can't possibly be right, they get very unhappy with me because they say it's the only sign, 3 days and 3 nights
In the grave,
in the
in
grave.
the tomb, yeah. What about
However,
what about this? What about that? You're Catholic. You've been deceived by the Catholic
right,
doctrine. It's like, well,
Catholics don't know how to count to three.
neither one of us is Catholic.
No,
Neither one of us reads any of the Catholic writings.
no.
My family actually left the Catholic Church when I was very young and discarded their teachings. I mean, that's my family started keeping the Sabbath. I mean,
Okay, so Lauren, we were just going to talk about the Torah portion,
okay, anyway.
and the Torah portion is talking about all these sacrifices and blood, fat and blood prohibited, and the ordination of Aaron and his sons. I know Passover is coming up, but why are we talking about 3 days and 3 nights? Where did this? I know why. Because there is a sign that was given to the disciples that the Son of Man will rise on the third day. And the
Yes.
issue is that the third day resurrection is destroyed by 3 days and 3 nights in the grave. You really cannot have both. And I know people will argue, oh, yeah, we can have it both. Can't have it both.
We worked out a timeline every which way we could think of, and you cannot have Messiah in his grave for 3 days
And
and
three nights.
still rise on the third day.
It's impossible. He rises
However,
on the fourth day.
In the sacrifices this week, we came across what the biblical concept of on the third day was.
Yes, and let's read it. Okay, so this is Leviticus chapter 7, and it starts at verse 16. If the sacrifice he offers is a vow or a free will offering, it is to be eaten on the day he presents his sacrifice.
That's the first day.
And what is left over may be eaten on the next day.
That's the second day.
But what remains of the sacrificial meat by the third day must be burned up.
There's your third day. So you have your day in which the sacrifice is made. You have your day after, which is still okay to eat a goodwill offering. On the third day, that sacrifice must be burned. So you only have one day, a whole day between the sacrifice and the third day, which fits with the timeline that we finally were able to make of Jesus' death and resurrection. If we had to give up the sign of Jonah being 3 days and 3 nights in the grave.
Okay, so we just got done reading about how on the first day is the sacrifice, the second day, and then the third day. So it's very specific. Now listen to what Yeshua says here. Now he took the 12, this is Luke chapter 18, verse 31. Then he took the 12 aside and told them, listen.
That's an important word.
We are going to Jerusalem. Everything that is written through the prophets about the Son of Man will be accomplished, for he will be handed over to the Gentiles. He will be mocked, insulted, spit on, and after they flog him, they will kill him, and he will rise on the third day.
There's no riddles here. There's no parable. There's no ambiguity whatsoever. He told them, he started with listen, which is
so essentially
important.
we have the sacrifice on the first day, then we have in the grave the second day, and on the third day the Son of Man rises. And there's no way to fit 72 literal hours into that time period. It's impossible.
But then we had a difficulty, and the difficulty was, what in the world is the sign of Jonah? If
Absolutely.
It's not, because what Messiah said was he would spend 3 days in the heart of the earth.
So what is the heart of the earth?
If it's not the tomb, what is he talking about?
See, Catholic doctrine says that when Jesus died, he went down into Sheol and he preached to the dead in Sheol. And then when he came up, he brought them back with him. And there's this whole story with it. So that's supposedly the 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. Except that heart of the earth is never really connected with the grave directly.
No, the ancient people of this time, or the people of this time, they call the grave, the tomb, they call it Sheol. But the heart of the earth, they said, was Jerusalem. Jerusalem in the midst of the earth, in the heart of...
So the heart is known as the middle of something. It's the heart. And Jerusalem was known as the midst, or the heart of the earth, the center of the earth. Just like Nineveh was known as the belly of the fish. And why is it known as the belly of the fish? Because they worship Dagon there.
The fish god.
The fish god. So they're colloquialisms. Now, I'm not saying Jonah did not spend 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the fish. Of course he did. But when Yeshua is making reference to the sign of Jonah, he's comparing what Jonah did 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the fish. So the Son of Man will be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth.
Now, one of the Gospels does try to clarify that what Yeshua meant by the heart of the earth was just as Jonah spent 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the fish. But that is an edit. It's clearly an edit. Messiah himself did not say that. He said in the heart of the earth, and we don't really know when the clarification was added. Was it added for the earliest?
Well, what's shocking to me is you've got over and over again in all 4 Gospels, at least 3 of the Gospels, the third day resurrection. And on the third day he will rise. On the third day. And then on the road to Emmaus, it has now been the third day since these things happened.
Yeah, the 2 who are walking with Yeshua on the road say, is it not the third day since these things have happened? They're describing the crucifixion.
Right.
So if Yeshua had been 3 days and 3 nights in the grave, they would have said something like, it has been days, or it has been 4 days. But they said it is the third day since these things happened.
Right. Also, the timeline works because you've got the morrow after the Sabbath. Now, I know the Wednesday crucifixion has multiple Sabbaths and multiple, timelines where you have the weekly Sabbath and the high Sabbath and all these things.
And it's true.
But the account talks about the preparation day on which he's crucified. He needs to be in the grave in the tomb before the Sabbath begins. Then it talks about on the Sabbath, and then it begins the story again on the morrow after the Sabbath,
which
the
was
first day of
also
the week.
if in the year that he was crucified, Passover did occur sundown on a Friday, and the high Sabbath and the weekly Sabbath coincided that year, that means that the day of first fruits would be undeniably the first day of the week. There's no question about when it would have been in that year. So Yeshua would have risen on the day of first fruits.
Right.
Uh,
Because the Torah records that the first fruits is the morrow after the
Now,
Sabbath.
there's some debate about whether that's the morrow after the high Sabbath or the weekly Sabbath. So you can always say that Yeshua rose on first fruits, depending on which, thought process. But this combines both of them. However,
Well, what's really cool is that the Septuagint even uses the exact same phrase, first of the Sabbaton, which is really neat. So when it talks about Mary Magdalene coming to the grave at the first of the Sabbaton, it's quoting the Septuagint's language for first fruits,
for the day of first fruits.
just right out of the Torah, right out of the Septuagint,
Right.
the Greek version of the Torah.
So the objections to this have really been the sign of Jonah. And
Yeah.
we've pondered and pondered over what the sign of Jonah could be, and suddenly had kind of a brainstorm that Yeshua said the sign of Jonah was the only sign to be given to the wicked generation. It was not the only sign to be given to believers. For
Well, we know the
example,
signs given to the believers.
John the Baptist.
We've got the healing of the lepers. We have the healing. We have the demons being cast out of people.
Right.
The lame are walking. The blind are seeing.
When John the Baptist asked Yeshua for a sign, he said, "Are you the one we seek, or do we wait for another?" He said, "Well, go back to John and tell him what you've seen. The
Right.
lame are walking, and the blind are seeing, and the deaf
Sign,
are
sign,
hearing."
sign, sign.
He said, "Believe these things and don't doubt." So his sign to John the Baptist had nothing to do with how long he'd be dead. It had everything to do with what he was doing with what he was alive. And to his apostles, he was very clear, "I will rise on the third day." It was only to the people who doubted him and were challenging him, he said, "To this wicked generation, only the sign of Jonah will be given."
No sign shall be given to you except
Right.
the sign of the prophet Jonah. And Luke does not include the 3 days and 3 nights.
No, he
It's
doesn't.
only the Gospel of Matthew that mentions 3 days and 3 nights.
So
one time.
we're hypothesizing it's just possible the sign of Jonah was the 3 days that he spent preaching in Nineveh, saying, "In 40 days, Nineveh is going to be destroyed." This was the sign God sent Jonah off in the first place to give. He said, "Go to Nineveh and tell them they're going to be destroyed in 40 days."
Right.
And the whole thing with the fish was a side journey. And then as soon as he gets Jonah back on track, he says, "Now go to Nineveh and do what I told you to do." Go to Nineveh and preach. And so it took Jonah 3 days to cross Nineveh preaching, and the people repented. So in 40 days, they were not destroyed. However, when Yeshua came to Jerusalem, he enters Jerusalem on the 10th day of the month. He is there until the 13th day of the month, which is the Last Supper. He's sacrificed then on the he stops preaching after that day. So he preaches for 3 days in Jerusalem. Now, if he really did die on a Friday, the only time that could have coincided properly with the Sabbath or with Passover would have been 30 AD, as far as we can tell. 40 years later, in 70 AD, Jerusalem was destroyed. So the sign to the wicked generation was that 40 days, 40 years, and that's often a thing in biblical prophecy, is a day is a year. 40 years later, they were destroyed.
They were destroyed. So he says, "You wicked generation, the only sign that's to be given to you is the sign of the prophet Jonah.
You haven't believed any of the other signs.
For just as Jonah was in the belly of the fish, he was in Nineveh preaching for 3 days and 3 nights." He was preaching. He says in the book of Jonah that it took 3 days to go from one end of the city to the other. And during those 3 days, Nineveh put on sackcloth and ashes and repented, begged God to forgive them, and God showed mercy.
And
that was the sign of Jonah. The Son of Man was in the heart of the earth, preaching for 3 days and 3 nights, preaching repentance, but Jerusalem did not put on sackcloth and ashes. They rejected him. Ultimately, they crucified him.
It's interesting that a significant portion of the teaching that's recorded in the Gospels happens in those 3 days.
It is. I mean, if you look at the Gospel, it's thick, the amount of
right. All
pages.
the teaching that he does before he gets to Jerusalem, those 3 days before he dies, is thin compared to all the things he talks about in those 3 days. He
Right.
really laid everything on the line in those 3 days.
Yes, he did. He really did. So we thought that was very interesting, and this happens every year at Passover, and it used to bother me. It used to bother
You
me
couldn't reconcile the timeline.
because in my mind it's like I knew it was 3 days and 3 nights because of course it's the sign of Jonah. But then I would hear all the on the third day, on the third day, on the third day. I'm like,
Yeah.
how do you make that work? How do you reconcile that? And it was not until I finally gave up on that traditional understanding of the sign of Jonah that it just clicked into place.
Also, it's very difficult to overcome when people are telling you that you're basically denying the only sign that Yeshua is Messiah. If you deny that the sign of Jonah is 3 days and 3 nights in the grave. And it took a little while to overcome the idea that, wait a minute, Yeshua gave us many other signs that he was Messiah.
Hmm.
It wasn't the only sign that he gave. It was, however, what he said would be the only sign given to the wicked
Wicked
generation or
generation.
the unbelievers
Right.
of the time,
Right. It was specifically to the scribes and the Pharisees. That was
or the
because,
Sadducees.
or the Sadducees, they were demanding from him a sign, and he said, no, no sign will be given to you except the sign of the prophet Jonah
To you.
to you. And then in the book of Luke, that's what I was looking for, he goes on and it talks about how the people from Sodom are going to rise up and judge you because they are more righteous. And then it says the men of Nineveh will rise up and because they were more righteous.
It's interesting that he chose those two cities.
Yeah, Sodom and Nineveh.
Well, I think Nineveh was known as such a wicked place. It was known as the belly of the fish. It was known as the center for the worship of the god Dagon, which, by the way, appears to be one of the most depraved, from the little bit we know about it, one of the most depraved worship practices had to do with the worship of the god Dagon. The Assyrians were barbarians on a scale we just barely understand.
Yeah,
They were a fearsome, fearsome, terrible, merciless people.
right.
And it had to do with the worship of their God, which has, by the way, elements that continue to this day.
That's a different topic altogether. But anyway, that happens every year, every Passover. And we thought it was fascinating when we read the Torah portion because it talked about the sacrifice, and then it talked about the following day, and then it talked about on the third day.
Right.
And as soon as we saw the on the third day, all sorts of bells went off in our head. It's like, oh yes, Yeshua promised that his disciples that he would rise, the Son of Man would rise on the third day. And he did.
Right. What it does for us is it indicates the thought that would be going through the minds of the disciples, because this was Leviticus is the first book that these young children, as young children, they'd learned.
Right.
So if you say on the third day, it's going to detail out in your mind what the sacrifice says. Yep, on the first day you eat it, on the second day you eat it, on the third day you burn it.
Right.
So, just as we would say every other day, and someone would know exactly what you meant.
So basically, the Torah is describing what it means to have a day, a second day, and a third day. And
Which seems elementary, but
yeah, I mean, that seems simple, but sometimes clarity is needed because maybe in ancient cultures there was a concept of 3 days and 3 nights fitting within a third day type of paradigm, but it just doesn't make sense to our modern ears. But this shows us that in the Torah there is a first day, second day, and on the third day,
right.
and it's literal.
And mostly what we've when we've gotten into discussions with people, what's interesting is that people will immediately begin throwing accusations. They'll say, "You just believe in Catholic reckoning. Well, you're going by those pagan days of the week and those
Right,
names." It's like, no, we're trying to go by what Jesus said.
right.
And Catholic doctrine has nothing to do with it. We haven't even read what the Catholic doctrine is on this.
Actually, the Catholic doctrine is 3 days and 3 nights.
It is, but they try to squeeze it into it's got to be Good Friday to Sunday, because they have tried to pin the celebration of the resurrection to a day of the week instead
Right,
of a time concurrent with Passover.
right.
It's like trying to say my birthday every year is going to be on a Thursday, even though my birthday is on the 28th of October.
Well, even if the crucifixion was on a Friday, that does not mean that we celebrate the Passover every year on the same day of the week.
No, we celebrate Passover when Passover is celebrated,
Right,
and then the resurrection occurs on the third day
right.
after Passover.
But the ultimate conclusion is that the high Sabbath, the 15th day of the month, was also the weekly Sabbath, the seventh day of the week. So that would explain why Yeshua died on the preparation day. He was in the tomb for the 15th day of the month, the high Sabbath,
And the weekly Sabbath
and the
together.
weekly Sabbath together, and then the Friday or the Sunday, the first day of the week, would be first fruits, the morrow after the Sabbath, according to the Torah, and the day that he resurrected, the 16th day of the month.
Which, right. And then 40 years later, Jerusalem is destroyed.
Correct. Because the Son of Man
The Son of Man preached
preached
in the
so
heart of the earth.
in the heart of the earth for 3 days and 3 nights, just as Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. So the Son of Man was in the heart of the earth. And he was saying, repent, the kingdom of heaven is near. It's not that much dissimilar to what Jonah was preaching to the Ninevites.
Then we had to reconcile the gap day, the day that supposedly occurs between the two Sabbaths. If we go back to our original thought that, crucifixion happens on a Wednesday, there's a high Sabbath. The women then go out the morning after the high Sabbath, which would be Friday by this reckoning. They spend all day buying spices, but they aren't able to get to the tomb, so then they wait all through Saturday, and then they show up on Sunday to wrap the body. And there was always something troubling to me about this, in that women in this culture were the ones that prepared the bodies. Men were not. And yet, Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus did a very courageous and beautiful thing. They showed up and they took Yeshua's body after he'd been crucified, and he died somewhere around 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And they got him into Joseph's tomb, wrapped in many, many, many pounds of spices that Joseph brought. I can't remember if Joseph or Nicodemus. One of the two of them went and got the spices, and they only would have known that he was going to die that day.
Right.
They went and got the spices, and they were ready to get him in that tomb before sundown, properly wrapped, or at least as properly as they could do it. And they had you can't imagine these guys are that experienced at going to the market and buying the spices for burial. But
No.
they managed to do
They
that in a
did.
few hours. And yet the women, who would have been highly motivated, this is a man they loved dearly, and every day that goes by makes this job more difficult and more gruesome. They spend an entire day searching for spices. That's it. They don't ever get to the tomb. They spend an entire day. However,
Before the Sabbath.
if we go by the theory that we're espousing, that there was no gap day, there was only one Sabbath, it would explain something else. They never saw that Joseph and Nicodemus wrapped Jesus' body,
Right.
because they only waited just long enough to see where Yeshua was buried. And they ran out to the market to get those spices, to get them ready before the Sabbath began, so that as soon as that Sabbath was over, they could go take care of the body.
And that's exactly what they did. They went out to try to get the spices before the Sabbath.
And they did it.
They did it, but they did not have time to actually apply it. So they rested according to the commandment, and at the very crack of dawn on the first day of the week, they came with the spices to anoint the body.
Which is more understandable in my understanding of how I would work and other women would work if this were someone close to me. I would not spend an entire day at the market gathering those spices.
No.
That would not be happening. I would be experienced at going to the market, and I would know where to get those things. Some of those women are from Jerusalem.
Right.
I would know where to get those things, and I'd be getting them lightning fast speed. I would have been at that tomb by lunchtime.
So this whole time I was looking for that passage in Luke because I want to read this. This is Luke chapter 11, verse 29. Now this is the gospel that does not say 3 days and 3 nights, but it does reference the sign of Jonah. It says, as the crowds were increasing, he began saying, this generation is an evil generation. It demands a sign, but no sign will be given to it except the sign of Jonah. For just as Jonah became a sign to the people of Nineveh, so also the Son of Man will be to this generation. The queen of the south will rise up in the judgment with the men of this generation and condemn them, because she came from the ends of the earth to hear the wisdom of Solomon, and behold, something greater than Solomon is here. The men of Nineveh will rise up at the judgment with this generation and condemn it, because they repented at Jonah's proclamation, and behold, something greater than Jonah is here.
They repented at Jonah's proclamation. So according to him, in this place, the sign of Jonah is Jonah's proclamation.
Yep.
And the people of Nineveh repented at the sign of Jonah.
Right. So yes, they repented at the sign of Jonah. His point is that Jerusalem is not repenting. They have the same sign given to Nineveh, but they are not repenting like Nineveh did. And the point is that they're both that generation, the wicked generation of Jerusalem, and the generation of Nineveh in Jonah's day are both going to rise up in the judgment at the same time.
And the men of Nineveh will stand righteous
The men of
compared.
Nineveh will stand righteous next to the people of the wicked generation because
That's
they heeded the sign of Jonah.
and realize what he's saying. He's basically saying the men of, well, let's say the Southern Baptist Church are going to rise at the same time as the men of ISIS. And the men of ISIS are going to stand in judgment against the men of the Southern Baptist Church because the men of ISIS repented and you didn't.
Kind of,
That's about the equivalent
that's
here.
kind of like what he's saying. Yep, there's going to be a bunch of ISIS members who beheaded a bunch of Christians but repented. They're
And
going to
they are
stand up
righteous.
and they're going to be righteous compared to you who never repented.
But you never were seen as wicked.
You never saw yourself as wicked.
You never realized that you had a problem. And I'm not saying anything about the Southern Baptist Church.
No.
I'm just trying to say if there is people who are known as Bible believing, very fundamental, very, very close to the book, and then people who are just wild, crazy men.
So, anyway, I wanted to read that out there because I think that the sign of Jonah is more clearly explained in the book of Luke, whereas we focus a bit too much, in my opinion, on a particular little line that talks about just as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the fish, so the Son of Man will be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. And we have a lot of tradition that connects the heart of the earth with the grave, and we connect it somehow in our minds with the third day resurrection. And we've come to the conclusion it must be 3 days and 3 nights.
It's a very difficult preconceived notion to address. I know because I've held that notion since I was a early teenager, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
Wednesday crucifixion. So I've got 20 years of history of believing a certain thing, and it took a lot of convincing. And it wasn't until Ben put together a timeline of what the Gospels say happened each day that's named in that time. They'll say on the 10th day this happened, on
Right.
the 5th day of the month this happened. And it became very clear that we could not fit 3 days and 3 nights
You just can't.
into the timeline that is given between the Gospels.
But you do fit the 3 days and 3 nights from the 10th of Nisan when he enters into Jerusalem to the 13th, the evening of the 13th, which is preceding the Last Supper when he finished his preaching. At that point, he basically said what he had to say.
And why is this important to us?
Because we want to be, because if a sign is given to us, a sign of righteousness, we want to recognize it.
Yes. Well, also because as we began celebrating Passover, we unpinned the celebration of the crucifixion and resurrection from where we had been traditionally putting it,
Mm-hmm.
because we've been raised, even Ben was raised in a Christian background, and I certainly was raised in a Christian background. We had to start putting it back where it belonged, which is on top of Passover.
Right.
And then we had to understand how can we put the events that happened onto Passover. Where do we celebrate the resurrection?
Right. When do we celebrate the resurrection?
Yeah, where does it fit?
Where does it fit?
Where is the time that Yeshua was hanging on that tree?
Well, we know that it was on the 14th, and on the 15th he was in the grave for the Sabbath, the weekly Sabbath and the high Sabbath. And on the festival of first fruits, the morrow after the Sabbath, the first of the Sabbaton, is the day he resurrected.
And by understanding this, I'm not sure that understanding the timeline totally would change a lot, but it does answer a lot of questions. And what's interesting is that as we worked out that timeline, I noticed that our celebration of Passover, we are speaking of today Yeshua died.
Right.
It's as if we combine a couple elements into Passover that we are remembering on that day, and one of them is this is the day.
I think the other thing it does is there's a tendency when you adopt Torah and move away from the traditional Christian church or even the Catholic Church, there's a tendency to really exalt yourself over them.
To scorn them.
And to scorn them. And one of the things that's scorned the most, for whatever reason, is the Friday crucifixion. If you're a person who is trying to observe the commandments of God as prescribed as possible. And it's revealed that that you believe in a Friday crucifixion and a Sunday resurrection, somehow,
You'll be treated like you're not a believer.
yeah, like you haven't shaken off that Babylon yet. You still have that
You got to go back and read some more. Go back
yeah,
and study.
go home and read your Bible, right? Well, that's what we're doing. We're going home and reading our Bible, and we see Yeshua resurrecting on the third day.
It has nothing to do, by the way, with Friday or Sunday or
No,
these days. It has everything to do with where can we fit Jesus himself, Yeshua himself, giving a sign of on the third day.
correct.
Were his words true or not true? Of course they were true.
We're given the commandment on how to observe the Passover, and right down to the day of the month. We know it's the 14th day of the month. We know that the 15th day of the month is a high Sabbath, and we know that the morrow after that Sabbath, the 16th,
day of first
is
fruits.
the day of first fruits. And by the way, the argument between is it the morrow after the high Sabbath or the weekly Sabbath, at least that year it doesn't matter because it was the same day.
Right. It was irrelevant.
It was irrelevant. So,
we're 30 minutes on the second segment.
we'll have part 1, part 2.
Well, this was a many-year project for Ben. I think it was 3 Passovers in a row. Every Passover, he'd work a little more on the timeline. And I'm like, oh, come on, it's Wednesday. What's wrong with you?
Because I knew you couldn't fit 3 days and 3 nights, 72 literal hours into a on the third day
Well,
resurrection.
it was when Ben started reading to me every time Jesus said on the third day. I'm like,
He
well,
says it a lot
there's
on
a
the third
problem.
day.
You're right. We have a problem here.
Even after he's resurrected on the third day comes up again.
Well, it was the road to Emmaus that really got me. It was when I suddenly realized that the two from Emmaus said, and it's the third day since these things have happened. And I said, wait a minute.
Okay, first day, he's crucified. Second day, and third day, he resurrected.
It makes sense. But the timeline works if we lose the idea of the sign of Jonah being 3 days and 3 nights in the grave. And that's just apostasy to many people. It's unthinkable to lose the sign of Jonah being interpreted that way. You don't lose the sign of Jonah. You have to rethink what it meant.
And the Gospels never say 3 days and 3 nights in the grave.
No,
never.
They never do.
Not even once.
The closest you can get is this supposed euphemism of heart of the earth.
Right. So I think we've pretty much
thoroughly covered that.
So I think we're going to end it on that note. It's been 32 minutes on part 2. So if you've made it this far, congratulations. You get thumbs up, and you get a second thumbs up just for that.
And I'm still awake.
Look at that. So we're going to call it an evening, and we're going to say good night for now.
Good night.